This is Right On Radio, the voice of resistance and reconquest.
Welcome to Right On Radio. My name is Daniel Friberg.
And I'm John Workin.
And I'm Jonas Thier.
And the topic of today's program is South Africa. And joining us today, we have Dan Roodt, who is an Afrikaner author and publisher who lives in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's also the founder of PRAAG, the Pro-Afrikaans Action Group, which campaigns for the Afrikaans language as well as the rights of the indigenous white minority in South Africa. He studied politics, philosophy, languages and literature at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, as well as the University of Paris in France, and worked for a while in the financial markets before becoming a full-time author and activist. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you very much.
First of all, could you tell us a little bit more about the time period after the abolishment of apartheid and up until now? I mean, obviously the situation for whites in South Africa has deteriorated quite a bit, and whites in South Africa are now facing widespread discrimination in the labor markets, in the university system, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and a little bit about your own background as well. As I take it, you were initially very critical of the apartheid system, right? And it was only later that you started your career as an activist for the white minorities' interests.
Yes, that's correct. You've actually now touched upon a whole number of topics there. So
yeah.
let's try and deal with them one by one. Okay, first of all, the situation after 1994. It's difficult to explain to outsiders what happened here, and even ourselves. We're only now really starting to appreciate what happened in 1994 because the entire country was overwhelmed by the local and the foreign media, and they painted this very rosy picture of what was going to happen in the future under a so-called multiracial democracy. And, a lot of people actually believed in that. And there was also a referendum in 1992, I think it was about May 92 or thereabouts, when everybody had to vote whether they supported these negotiations that Mr. de Klerk was engaging in with the ANC, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party. And everybody thought that these were negotiations, but that, and they trusted Mr. de Klerk that he would negotiate on their behalf, and that eventually there would be some sort of proposal, and then they would be able to vote again. In fact, there was a promise that there would be a second referendum if there had to be a new constitution in the making. But in actual fact, what happened then was that there was just a complete, the old National Party and Mr. de Klerk and his chief negotiator, whose name was Rolf Meyer, their entire stance just completely collapsed, and they more or less just took over everything that the ANC and the South African Communist Party proposed. And we ended up with a system which is sort of like a de facto one-party state almost, and where numbers and demographics count for everything. So, and they redrew all the provincial and municipal boundaries in such a way that nowhere do we have any political influence whatsoever. There's an area not far from here, area around Pretoria and towards the east, where there are about 500,000 white people living there, and they don't have their own municipality. They are dominated. I mean, they actually redrew the municipal boundaries to take them over the next province, so that now there's another 1.5 million blacks on the other side that are living about 100 kilometers away from Pretoria, and they use those numbers in order to get enough municipal councillors so that they can actually dominate the real inhabitants of Pretoria. So, and it goes like that everywhere. They've even, some of the smaller towns and so on, they've sort of grouped them together into these mega municipalities so that they can make sure that nowhere do we have any say in what gets decided. The only place where there's a bit of an exception is down in the Western Cape, because the demographics there is different. There's a majority of mixed race coloreds there, and the whites are about 20%, and then the blacks are about 20%. There used to be only 10%, but a lot of them are actually migrating towards Cape Town, and there's a sort of an opposition government there, or the opposition party is in control there. So conditions are slightly better down in the Western Cape, but in the longer term, it's not going to last, and eventually it will become, I think, like the rest of South Africa. But there's a tremendous sense that we were betrayed by Mr. de Klerk and this guy, Roodt Meyer, who is supposed to be doing the negotiations. And they really, they just accepted a bunch of proposals that didn't suit us at all. And the Constitution is also, it's sort of hardwired into the Constitution that there would be affirmative action and a sort of an anti-white legitimate discrimination throughout. So, and that since then, along the way, we've discovered at each point where something that was written in the Constitution was qualified by another clause, and that in fact we don't have very many rights at all. I mean, most of the rights that people take for granted elsewhere in the world, we don't have them. We don't even have the right to have to speak our own language in our own schools, or for the parents to have a say in their schools. There's actually a Schools Act that does give schools some form of autonomy, and where the parents and what we call the school governing body actually has a say in the appointment of teachers, and especially in setting the language policy of the school. And that lasted for a while, but in this province, in the center of the country, the provincial education department has actually gone to court, and it's gone right up to the Constitutional Court. And they then scrapped this, and they said that that the government and the ruling party, they would determine how many pupils could be admitted to a school, and also what the language policy of that school would be. So, they can decide everything for us. And of course, the issue, I've just written a piece about language at the universities in English, which appeared on the American Renaissance website. It's amrain.com, and people might find that interesting because I go into all the conflicts that we've had over the last year or two around language at universities, where most of the black students see English as an international language, and they want to study in English, whereas we used to have at least 5 or 6 universities that were Afrikaans language only universities. But they've simply, they've been admitted to those universities, and a lot of the classes have switched over to English, but that has not been enough for them. The fact that they are being accommodated in their language of choice at these universities, they now want Afrikaans to be completely abolished at the universities, because they say that it's offensive to them, and they also say that the white students do better because they're allowed to study in their mother tongue, and so on. So all of those issues have developed over the last 20 years, and we've discovered that we don't really have very many rights left in the Constitution. And then, of course, you can't every day go to court with some issue when you have a problem at work, or with the administration, a language issue or a racial issue where you didn't get a job because you were white, or there are lots of court cases around issues like that. In fact, some of them have been won, some of them have been lost. I mean, there was one particular case where a white policewoman, she was a captain in the police, and she was the most suitable candidate for promotion in her district, and then they refused to promote her because she was white. And there was a trade union that took the issue to court, and they spent 10 years fighting this case through the various levels of the courts, right up to the Constitutional Court, and they lost there. So and people who had pinned their hopes on this case that now at least white people could also get promotion in the police, but they lost that one. There was another case recently by the same trade union where they won a case where an engineer was refused appointment at the Pretoria municipality because he was white, and then and now the judge has said that in that instance there was discrimination against him. So, but still, these are just a few people who are lucky enough to have somebody supporting them, and it costs almost millions to go all the way through all of these courts and through all the trouble of making a big case like that. Whereas the people on the ground, they have to suffer this type of discrimination all of the time. At the universities, in some disciplines, especially in medicine and veterinary science, there are racial quotas, and at the University of Pretoria, where there are 500,000 white people living in that area, only 10% of the medical students are allowed to be white. So a lot of them are very disappointed, and also they now have to get very high marks to qualify for that. For admission, they have to get at least 96% average, in the school leaving exam, whereas, a black student could have 55 or 60, and he would be admitted. He and all his friends up to 90% of the quota. So these things are very unfair. And of course, then we can probably speak about the issue of the violence as well, and the tremendous.
I don't think most people outside of South Africa are probably not aware of these things. I wasn't quite aware that there were racial quotas on the universities, for example, or at the universities, I should say. So it's actually been, after 94, it's been a complete, and really no pun intended, there's been a blackout about the development in South Africa. What do you think that is?
Yes. Well, that's another issue. I sometimes people give me old books and collections and so on, and I used to also buy a lot of old books in some of the second-hand bookshops around Johannesburg and Pretoria, and I discovered a book written in the late 1930s where the author was complaining about how biased the Johannesburg media were towards the local population. And I'm sure that complaint was also heard in the 1890s on the eve of the Anglo-Boer War. People were also saying that. And even today, our media are tremendously biased against us. And of course, the foreign media, even worse. It's even worse. If you read the London Guardian, they normally have a permanent correspondent here in Johannesburg, or the New York Times, all of these major foreign newspapers, as well as the BBC and some of the American channels and so on.
I live in the UK since 10 years, and so I know exactly what.
Yes. So they ignore all of these things, but as soon as there's some sort of minor incident, for example, where a white person is fingered for being a racist or making some sort of racist statement, then it's international news. You may be aware that towards the end of last year or beginning of this year, there was a woman down in a little town on the Natal South Coast. She was an estate agent, and she simply complained about, her name is Penny Sparrow, and she simply complained about the habit of blacks over on New Year's Day to actually invade all the beaches down there, and especially in Durban as well, and then to leave tremendous amounts of litter on the beach, like papers and bottles and all kinds of things they just simply leave behind. And she made sort of she wrote something ironic about that on Facebook, and she also said something to the effect, I can't remember her exact words, but we'll have to educate these people, otherwise they're simply acting like naughty monkeys. And that phrase, naughty monkeys, was immediately latched on by various people. I mean, she was a completely unknown person, not a public figure at all, saying something on her Facebook, and that within a couple of hours, it was all over Facebook and Twitter and the press and the media, and the government even responded to that. And she is now, she has been charged with hate speech, and she can even get a prison sentence for that, but they're talking that require a 200,000 Rand fine, about $15,000. I said they're asking for a 200,000 Rand fine against her, which was about $15,000 or maybe 12,000 euros, and and she's also going to have to do community service for black people and so on. So she's going to be fined and going through a whole re-education sort of a program. There was another incident where an economist from one of the local banks here, one of the big local banks, Standard Bank in Johannesburg, their economist tweeted that the black sense of entitlement in South Africa was negative for the economy. And sooner or later, we'll have to look at affirmative action and so on. And then he was immediately repudiated by his employer, and he was actually given a disciplinary hearing for also being a racist by making such a statement. And he was then eventually forced to resign. These two incidents, though, this Penny Sparrow one and the Chris Hart one, it kept the local media busy for weeks. And it was also written about, I'm sure, in the UK and in the US and so on. So these completely minor sort of transgressions of racial etiquette, they make international news. But when it comes to all these other much more serious issues like the violence and the farm murders and the systemic discrimination against white young people who were actually born within this so-called democratic system after 1994, like the kids who are going to university now, they were born in 96 or 97, they never knew any form of segregation or white supremacy or white government, anything of the kind. In fact, I've got a 13-year-old son, and when he was about 10 or so, he asked me, Dad, has there ever been a white government in South Africa? Because, looking at the TV and so on, he never sees whites in positions of authority, and that somehow he'd sort of seen somewhere that previously there was a white government in South Africa. So they grow up in this kind of racially dominated black system, and despite all of that, they are still being punished for whatever sins their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had supposedly committed.
Well, can I ask you though, Dan? I mean, if you look at not only the attitude of the ANC before they came to power, but of course the attitude of the international community and especially of the media in the years before apartheid. Like yes. I still remember there was one of Mel Gibson's Lethal Weapon films. He ends up fighting against some Afrikaners, and they were depicted almost like Nazis in the film. This was in the late 80s.
Yes.
Were white South Africans actually surprised that this was how things developed after 1994, or was it just basically?
Well, you see, I think that a lot of them were not that aware of it because they were living in South Africa, so exposed to our media, which at that time still were not as bad as they are now. So they were not that aware of. Obviously they were aware of criticisms of the UN and so on, and the sort of communist bloc and Eastern European countries and some of the African countries who were very critical of us, but they thought that we are sort of white Western people, and somehow, somewhere, the Western countries were still on our side. But they were, I think, mistaken in that. And so they weren't aware of this huge kind of propaganda wave that was washing over South Africa, and that eventually brought the ANC to power, because that was what brought it to power. I mean, they had nothing else. They didn't really have any local organization to speak of, but it was the sheer sort of wave of propaganda that carried them into power in South Africa. And I myself, it was quite a shock to me when I first went to live in France in 1985. End of 85, and I became aware of just how one-sided and stereotyped and hostile all the foreign publicity was against South Africa. I mean, because even if you were against the old system, you had to kind of acknowledge that it is a very complicated country and a very complex history and so on. We've still got that media problem, and we've always had a bad press against us. How do you overcome that? Now, in the era of the internet, I think it's slowly changing.
Of
but
course.
Today, I sort of just typed in white South Africans or Afrikaners into Google, and then immediately, you get all of this negative propaganda jumping up at you. So we're going to have to address these things in a very organized kind of a way to try and get alternative information out there. And it's going to be a hard struggle, I think, to get things like Wikipedia to give a more balanced view of our history and to counter all of this left-wing kind of anti-white and anti-white South African propaganda that you see on the internet, because they never talk about any of the...
I was going to say, I think that the fortunate thing, though, now is that, with the growth of alternative media on the internet and with social media, it should be possible to do that. Like, that's basically what, we've been doing, those of us on the real right, as Daniel calls it, in the U.S. and in Western Europe. We've been able to develop this sort of alternative media. It sounds like maybe white South Africans need to do the same thing, but not just for themselves.
Yes. But you already did, basically. I mean, your own site is quite influential and quite well read, and I can see that you have almost 40,000 followers on Twitter. So certainly there has been a lot of progress in that department when it comes to the influence of the alternative media, and also the fact that more and more people, it's becoming more and more difficult for the mainstream liberal media in the West and in the rest of the world to hide what is really going on in South Africa, because it's so horrible. The situation is deteriorating so fast, and I mean, it's difficult to hide the fact that, for example, thousands and thousands of whites are being slaughtered in their farms. I mean, the farm murders is like, it's almost like a part of a widespread campaign to eliminate the white presence in South Africa. The denial of you to use your own language in schools, for example, and the widespread discrimination we touched upon earlier, all of these are at least fulfills at least some of the criteria for the UN definition of genocide. Do you think it's appropriate to say that there is, in some way, some sort of genocide against whites going on in South Africa today, Dan?
Yes, I think so, because if you look at the actual definition, it doesn't contain anything about numbers. It says that persons that are that are being killed on the basis of their race or ethnicity or their descent, language, and so on, and that's definitely happening in South Africa, and we have anti-white hate speech all the time. And even in the mass media, people are, toying with also. It's almost as if it's going further and further all the time, because some of these announcers on the black radio stations and so on, they would get some radical black out there who's made a very radical statement about white people, and at the university here in Johannesburg, at my old university, they had T-shirts there saying "Kill all whites," and they took pictures of those, and those would be published in the newspapers, and then there would be some sort of a debate about that afterwards. But it's being made acceptable, and people are conditioned to sort of accept these statements. So the climate is kind of hotting up all the time against us, and there's very little rationality left.
Exactly, and I mean, this is an interesting comparison that can be made to Europe, for example. I mean, imagine someone going around with a T-shirt saying "Kill all blacks" in Europe. He would be like put in prison. Although in South Africa, that is fine to do against. I mean, this blatant racism against whites is encouraged even. I mean, Julius Malema.
Yeah, well, the university then distanced itself from the students who had that slogan on their T-shirts, and they even had it on a banner and so on. But nothing happens to them afterwards. They aren't expelled or disciplined or anything like that. Whereas down at the University of Stellenbosch, which is supposedly still an Afrikaans university, there was another very kind of mediatized or incident where two young girls were on their way to a fancy dress party as aliens. It was sort of a outer space kind of a fancy dress party. And they painted their faces purple to be Martians or, aliens from outer space. And then somebody took a picture of their faces and kind of darkened it a bit with Photoshop and put it on Facebook or somewhere. And the next moment, they were accused of mocking blacks, of it being blackface, and they were immediately expelled from the university. No questions asked. And it took the one girl's father, he's some sort of orthodontist or something like that, and he must have quite a bit of money. And it took him and his lawyer several weeks to actually get his daughter readmitted to university. And after having had her name dragged through the mud in all the media and so on. So they're very quick to jump on the slightest, as I say, there's sort of slightest transgression of racial etiquette out there that committed by a white person, even a young white person. They are immediately, jumped on. Whereas, the blacks literally get away with murder. And in some cases, it's literal because they would be almost caught red-handed killing some white person, and then the police would make such a mess of the investigation and of the evidence that eventually the case would be thrown out of court and those murderers would walk away scot-free.
Yeah. How has this sort of affected the whites of South Africa, would you say? Have they become intimidated or has it worked in that sense?
Well, yeah, a lot of the students at universities now are very intimidated, and they're very reluctant to say anything. That the whites just keep their heads low and they try and study and get their degrees, and then they don't say very much, and they're not very politically active at all, out of fear that if they had to become active or more vocal, then they would be simply expelled or victimized by the universities. It's had that effect. Of course, the university lecturers they toe the line completely, and they are, they are very politically correct up to the point of almost everyone, at least in the humanities, being cultural Marxists these days. It's all just feminism and
universal phenomenon, though.
Yes, it's all just feminism and whiteness, and we have to re-educate ourselves to become more diverse and more accepting of Africans and other races, and that the white race is a guilty race and all that. That's firmly
white
embedded.
Privilege.
Yes, white privilege and all that. People write theses about that and so on. I mean, my daughter comes home and she shows me the kind of stuff that she has to write, otherwise she wouldn't pass. So, there's that aspect. But I think there is also a kind of a rebellion against it, and you see it especially on social media. And what's interesting is that on Facebook, there are large groups of, these groups and pages and so on with maybe 50,000 people or more. And they speak their minds on Facebook. And because it's in Afrikaans and Facebook cannot police it entirely, people say more or less freely what they think. And they do seem to be quite rebellious and against the system, and they're rejecting all of this political correctness. So I think if you look at the man in the street there has been sort of a swing to the right almost, except that it's not being expressed politically. And the party politics in South Africa is a complete mess, because you can sort of choose from the Liberal Party to the anti-white left-wing party to the extreme Marxist-Leninist party, and there's nothing else. People have tried to form other parties and so on, but they just get nowhere because they don't get much by the way of media attention. And there's a sort of a psychosis that people have to vote. The opposition has to all vote for the Liberal Party against the ANC, and that's going to solve our problem. But in the meantime, the Liberal Party, the DA, has moved that much closer to the ANC position, where now they are also getting anti-white. They've also got a black leader, and they're making more or less the same noises as the ruling ANC. So it hasn't really helped us at all. So
and also you have this huge difficulty. I mean, just in terms of numbers, it's impossible in this kind of mass democracy as a small and shrinking oppressed minority to really make your voice heard and to have any sort of influence at all against this huge majority of blacks who basically just want to kick you out of the country or kill you, or even worse. I don't know. But the sentiment is certainly anti-white, as my impression. And also before we continue on that, I'm really curious how the infrastructure and society as such has deteriorated in these past 20 years. I suppose I've seen a lot of kind of depressing photos of places like before apartheid and from today. And for me, it's quite obvious that things have gotten really, really bad. I mean, in terms of just order and infrastructure. What is your take on that, Dan?
Yes, certainly. Similarly to what's happened in the United States, you've had the decay of the inner cities. Except for Cape Town, which is a bit of a different case, but all the other major of the big four cities in South Africa, Pretoria, Johannesburg, and Durban, apart from Cape Town now, all of them have become sort of third world. The inner cities have become third world. They are deteriorating. They are smelly. People urinate in the street, and there are these sort of African small traders who sell just very basic things or Chinese goods or fruit or vegetables right on the street. So you would have this skyscraper designed by some famous architect from the 1970s in the middle of downtown Johannesburg, and the offices would be mostly empty, and down on the sidewalk there would be a third world trader either selling Chinese shoes or trinkets or maybe some fruit and vegetables. So all of that infrastructure. I mean, the investors in the downtown areas have written off the value of those buildings a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So that has happened, but there's a sort of a phenomenon of white flight where people left the main what we call the CBDs or the central business districts, and they created in Johannesburg a new downtown area in a place called Sandton, and that's where all the main businesses and banks and so on are now. And in Pretoria, it's sort of moved to the east. And so it's creeping sort of northwards in Johannesburg and eastwards in Pretoria. So people have created new infrastructure too. We've also built a group of Afrikaner engineers, formed a company, and they actually persuaded the provincial government to support the idea, and they built quite a modern rail system linking Pretoria to Johannesburg and to this new business center in Sandton, which they call the Gautrain, after Gauteng, which is the name that the ANC gave to the central little province in South Africa. So it's kind of a mixed bag, on the one hand, and of course the water situation. Water and electricity have deteriorated. At one time we suffered electricity blackouts. Now it's a bit less. But the water, I think in Johannesburg it's still okay, the water, because there's a very big kind of water utility supplying it to the city. But in very many of the rural towns you can't drink the water anymore. And there are literal crises where people don't have water at all, just because the infrastructure has not been maintained by the new black municipal councillors and so on. And a lot of the roads and our railways, I mean, we used to have really good railways here, but those are only a kind of shadow of what they were. It's all road transport now for goods and very little passenger transport. It's also not what it used to be. So yes, the infrastructure has definitely gone down. Things have not been maintained, and they haven't invested enough. They've mostly spent money on salaries for the huge army of civil servants that the ANC took on. There are 2 million bureaucrats now in South Africa. 2 million.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. We're going to continue to discuss this topic very soon, but before that, I would like to just play a short sound clip. It's from one of my favorite American preachers, actually. He's a famous person within the American black community, and is based in Harlem, New York, where he's a pastor of the Atla World Missionary Church, and he's very critical of the ANC government. And we're just going to listen to a very short quote by him, and after that, regarding this topic, and after that, I would like you to say what you think, and if he's right, whether or not he's right, and so forth. So just bear with me for a second. I'll start it up here.
The worst thing that could ever happen to South Africa was when they gave it to Nelson Mandela and black folk. That was a great nation. Now, notwithstanding apartheid was wrong, we all know it's wrong. I'm against it. There should have been some other resolution, though, than turning it over to Nelson Mandela. Disease, AIDS, and crime is running wild in Johannesburg. They're killing one another over there. They're dying of sickness. The government is mismanaged. The people who ran the nation are now leaving the nation because black folk don't know how to run no nation. They don't know how, and we need to admit it. I know you don't like it, but you need to stop shucking and jiving. We got a problem.
So we just heard a quote from the highly esteemed Pastor James Manning, who's a popular figure in the American black community. Any spontaneous comments on that, Dan?
Yeah, well, on the empirical evidence, he's right. We even translated a French book written by a liberal journalist or a left-wing journalist, even from the Le Monde newspaper, from French into Afrikaans. The thing was called La Négrologie, and the subtitle was Pourquoi l'Afrique meurt, why Africa is dying. And, he makes exactly that same point, perhaps not in as direct a fashion as Pastor Manning, but he demonstrates how since independence, the African countries have all deteriorated. The infrastructure created by the white colonial administrations has gone down, and there have been, famines and genocides and so on in very many African countries. And in South Africa, despite the fact that maybe at some point whites didn't want to stand in the same queue in the post office as blacks. That was really the sort of petty what they called petty apartheid or segregation, which they also had in the United States, in the South. That was really a minor issue, but on the whole, whites had a very beneficial effect here. They developed the country and its infrastructure, and they educated everybody. The churches also made a major contribution in uplifting blacks and weaning them from some of their more extreme pagan habits like witchcraft and so on. There's one apartheid law which is still on the statute books, and that's one from 1957 outlawing witchcraft and magic, and where people are actually intimidated by means of witchcraft and rituals and some very extreme stuff, even human sacrifice and so on. And that law banned all of that, and that's still on the statute books from 1957. So
have you seen a sort of resurgence of cannibalism and that kind of extreme, those kinds of extreme practices coming back after?
It's still, I think shortly after 1994 there was a resurgence, and there was even a government commission under the ANC that investigated it, and I've got a copy of that report here, which apparently has also been suppressed, and it's even been removed from the university libraries and so on. Okay. So it's very hard to get a copy of it, but somebody made a copy for me and bound it for me, so I've got one here. And if you read that thing, it makes your hair stand on end. There are all kinds of incidents there recounted, murders and rituals and sacrifices and so on. But we haven't really seen, I can't remember a sort of a cannibalistic incident over the last few years. It may have happened, but I think human body parts definitely are being used in what we call muti or medicine. The African word for that is muti. They're definitely still using body parts and there have been scandals in the press, say over the last year or two, where say somebody working in a morgue or in the hospital or whatever would actually harvest some of these body parts from corpses and so on, and sell them to witch doctors. That kind of thing is still taking place. But in the early 1950s, there was an horrific incident where one of the first sort of riots, really big riots that we had in this country took place down in East London, in the Eastern Cape, especially precisely that sort of area where Nelson Mandela's tribe comes from. And there was a riot, and an Irish nun who her first name was Elsie. I've forgotten now her surname. I could look it up, but she came driving into this black area, and they simply stoned her vehicle and dragged her out of the car and burnt her to death right there and then, after having spent her whole life, working for these black people. And and they actually ate some of her flesh. So that was an incident, a modern sort of incident of cannibalism in South Africa. And that was also, at the time, the newspapers down there wrote about it, but I'm sure it didn't get into the foreign press at all. And I think that came as a big shock to the government at the time. And I think some of the measures that they took after that was to prevent things like that from reoccurring in the future. And I think, underlying this kind of tendency towards segregation in South Africa, what foreigners don't realize is that we have a long history of sort of racial violence in this country, and especially black on white atrocities. And at one point,
and the same in the US, of course. I mean, exactly. We have the same in the South, especially, same history.
Yes.
Yeah.
And all of that, of course, is suppressed by these more politically correct commentators and historians. They write about all the wrongdoings of the whites and so on, and Sharpeville and Soweto, but they never mention the far more serious incidents that took place where blacks committed atrocities against whites.
Exactly. And after this very enlightening and interesting discussion about this beautiful black culture, I think it's time to counterbalance it with some proper white South African culture, because we're going to music break and we're going to listen to what I assume is quite famous artist in South Africa, Bok van Blerk, and the name of the song is De La Rey. So enjoy, and talk to you after the break.
Op 'n berg in die nag lê ons in donker en wag. In die modder en bloed lê ek koud, streepsak en reën kleef teen my. En my huis en my plaas tot kolle verbrand, sodat hulle ons kan vang. Maar daai vlamme en vuur brand nou diep, diep binne my. De la Rey, sal jy die boere kom lei? De la Rey, generaal, generaal, soos een man sal ons om jou val, generaal. De la Rey, oor die kakies wat lag, handjie van ons teen 'n hele groot mag. En die kraanse lê hier teen ons rug, hulle dink dis verby. Maar die hart van 'n boer lê dieper en wyer, hulle gaan dit nog sien. Op 'n perd kom hy aan, die leeu van die Wes-Transvaal. De la Rey, sal jy die boere kom lei, Delaray, Delaray. Generaal, generaal, so seeman sal ons om jou val, generaal, Delaray. Delaray, Delaray, sal jy die boere kom lei, Delaray, Delaray. Generaal, generaal, so seeman sal ons om jou val, generaal, Delaray. Want my vrou en my kind lê in 'n kamp en vergaan, en die kakies se mug loop oor 'n nasie wat weer op sal staan.
Arctos is currently holding a Kickstarter campaign to fund the translation of 3 of the French New Right author Guillaume Fay's works into English: Archaeofuturism 2.0, Understanding Islam, and Controversy in Society. Please see the program description for a link to details about the campaign and about how you can be among the first to receive the books when they are published.
There we're back from the break, and you just listened to Delaray by the South African artist Bok van Blerk. And as I understand it, this song has quite some relevance. I mean, it's a song about the historical hero of the Boers, and you also have some movie that recently came out. And please tell us a little bit about the relevance of the song and about this new movie, Dan.
Yes, I think when that song came out, just quite a number of years ago, it could be even 10 years ago, this Delaray song, it caused this sort of kind of a nationalistic collective sentiment among Afrikaners in South Africa, and their need for a great leader like Delaray or De Wet or any of these World War heroes. And somebody told me that somebody played this song, or Bok van Blerk, I think, sang the song at some shopping center not too far from here on the West Rand. And there were 6,000 people in the parking lot listening to it. And tears were streaming down their cheeks while they were listening to the song. And apparently the government also got very worried about this song, and, that it was having such an effect. But somehow I think that moment has passed, and I think Bok van Blerk is still a very popular artist, but he doesn't really play much of a political role at all. So even though his music is sort of has got this almost militaristic rhythm and drum beats and so on, and the content of the lyrics often tends towards nationalism, he himself that doesn't play that kind of role much. But I would say even though, sort of politically we've struggled to find a voice in the recent past, in the field of popular music especially, like with Bok van Blerk and also Steve Hofmeyr and some of these other artists, there's been a tremendous flowering of new music and also movies. a lot of, because at one point the Afrikaans movie scene almost died down completely, and there were very few Afrikaans movies. We just watched Hollywood movies all the time, or overseas movies, maybe here and there, a European movie on a film festival and so on. But now suddenly over the last few years, there's been a yearning for local movies and local talent, and people are now making movies, and they are having success at the box office. And Bok van Berg has just played in a movie. He didn't have the main role, but this movie is also very interesting because it was made by somebody who composed some music and also wrote some sort of musicals about the Anglo-Boer War and also about the Angolan War. He wrote 2 musicals like that were also very popular in Pretoria. They played in the State Theatre, and he's now just released this film called Modder en Bloed, blood and mud. Somehow it sounds doesn't sound as nice in English, but because it's sort of monosyllabic words, and it sort of deals with the Anglo-Boer War, but it's more because it's not a very high budget movie. There aren't any great battle scenes or anything like that. The bulk of the movie actually takes place on the island of St. Helena, where there are these Boer prisoners who have to survive, and eventually they play a rugby game against their warders, which is also a bit of a cliche, but he does it in such a nice... The name of the director and the producer is Sean Else. He's quite a young guy, and he was involved in these musicals and so on. And he does it in such a nice way, and there's a tremendous sort of nationalistic undercurrent throughout the movie. And even though it deals with, very kind of heavy conflict at the time between the Boers and the British, there's a female English character who, and she kind of softens the whole thing, and there's a sort of a mutual humanity between some of the English characters and the Boer prisoners there, and it sort of ends on quite a happy note, the whole thing. And what somebody also pointed out to me was that in that movie, there's not a single black or mixed race, colored or Indian or character at all. So it's just the cast is completely white, which in our day and age seems almost like some sort of crime or something. And it surprises me that nobody has said anything about that, because the government, the movie was also made with some government subsidy or funding, and it was released on the main circuit and so on. It's still being shown in Pretoria and most of the other Afrikaans areas. So that kind of thing, I think, can be very fruitful for us going forward, making films and music and sort of using that as a platform to rebuild people's identity and, create something worthwhile, because we've got such a strong tradition to draw from. People who emigrate to Australia and Canada and these places, they become aware that those countries, unlike probably most countries in Western Europe or Britain, haven't got as a very strong identity. Australians are really the descendants of some British criminals and so on, and they did participate in the world wars and so on, but in a very sort of peripheral fashion. They don't really have a grand narrative, going back hundreds of years, whereas we've got that. Historically
speaking, of course, the U.S. and Australia don't go back that far, and even a lot of
the U.S. has got it's got quite a strong history with the pioneer, the Revolutionary War, and the Civil War.
Whites today don't really identify with that so much anymore. Maybe in the South and in parts of the West.
Yeah.
But in large parts of the country, you really don't have that. So if you still have that in South Africa, I think that's definitely something to be drawn on. When people have a myth, in a sense of identity to motivate them, I think that's more valuable than having a political party.
And I think it's also important to maybe start writing, also maybe in English, about some of these cultural phenomena in South Africa taking place, because even these sort of more innocuous Afrikaans movies, like love stories and so on, they contain interesting elements, because it's always sort of set out in the country, and it's in this kind of utopian set up on a farm somewhere, and it's always among, it's white people on a farm where the whole thing. No, sometimes what happens is that a girl in the city living a very hectic sort of a corporate life would suddenly inherit a piece of land out there. And that would change her life completely, and she would go back to her roots, and then she would meet the love of her life in that sort of country utopian space, and on a sort of subconscious level, I think these directors and script writers and so on, they're working with things that appeal to people, the notion of escaping from these multicultural, violent cities towards some sort of rural utopia out there that's been untouched by all of this.
Would you say that this is typically sort of an Afrikaner phenomenon?
Yes, I think so. You don't see it much in other films, I don't think. Maybe in the US or they've made similar things, but yeah, this is very strong in a lot of these.
No, but as compared to the English segment of the whites in South Africa, I was thinking.
Yes. Yeah, these films are all made in Afrikaans. I think a lot of them, or some of them are, some of the English speakers also go to watch these movies. But yeah, it's more a sort of an Afrikaans problematic, because traditionally the English speakers have been more concentrated in the major cities, except for the Natal province. So maybe they don't identify that strongly with the countryside. But still, I think it is. Although what I found surprising when I went sort of on a Saturday afternoon to watch it, and there weren't very many people in the cinema, but there were some blacks and colours also watching this movie about the Anglo-Boer Wars. So I was quite surprised by that. So I think it is, it's speaking to a wider audience as well, apart from the sort of core Afrikaans audience that it's targeting, these sort of popular films. And then in this, there's sort of an underground literary scene almost, where people are writing these kind of dystopian novels about some sort of apocalyptic future ahead of us. And I think there will be more and more of that kind of stuff as well.
Well, you've written a number of books yourself, including novels. I unfortunately, I've never seen a copy of any of them. But what themes do you deal with in your own work? Do you draw on this sort of?
I haven't published anything very recently, but I wrote a novel about 10 years ago, which dealt with the time when I. Sort of set back in the time when I lived in France, and it dealt with the sort of theme of exile and especially this surrounding anti-South African propaganda, and it's sort of a love story set in that time among two people living in France and sort of traveling around Europe. And I tied that a little bit to the European Romantic movement, because the main character was a pianist, but a sort of a failed pianist in a way, because he didn't achieve any real fame or anything like that. That's something that's also very strong among Afrikaners in South Africa, is classical music. In Pretoria has got a very organized and lively classical music scene, and the university there also produces a lot of outstanding classical musicians, pianists, opera singers, and people, and they find, and normally, unfortunately, they get stolen, as it were, by other countries, and they end up in the US or in Britain or in Europe somewhere, making careers over there, because there's just not enough money for classical music in South Africa, especially under this government, which...
It's unfortunate. Not surprising, but unfortunate.
There's no support for classical music whatsoever. So it's all kind of privately funded, or just people buying tickets at concerts and so on, that keeps it going.
Well, go ahead, please.
Yes, well, and then last year, I wrote this little essay called Raiders of the Lost Empire. And somebody has just called me yesterday, and he's just read it, and he was very excited about it. And he said, more people should read it. It was sort of ignored, because it was written in English. It was sort of ignored by all the English media in South Africa, because it dealt with the theme of English South African identity, or the sort of English identity that the ANC is trying to create in South Africa, because they had to create an all-new identity from 1994 onwards, because before they were sort of the leaders of the South African Communist Party were East European Jews from Lithuania and places like that, and they weren't really very South African either. And they were working together with Nelson Mandela and his people from the Eastern Cape tribe, the Khoisas. But they couldn't offer the country any sort of ready-made identity apart from Eastern European communism, which was then more or less anathema after the Berlin Wall came down. So I discovered a very interesting PhD thesis written by a woman here in Johannesburg, where in the advertising industry, where she looked at how the advertisers started to create a new South African identity from 1994 onwards, especially one advertiser, the huge beer company, which I think is now the biggest or the second biggest in the world. It's now called SAB Miller. It used to be South African Breweries or SAB, but it merged with Miller, and I think it's the second or the biggest one in the world now. And they've got the biggest ad spend, so-called, in South Africa, and they put millions and millions into these ads showing, blacks and whites drinking beer together and being patriotic about the rugby team or the cricket team and so on. But it was all in English, and the sort of entire Afrikaner element, even within rugby, was sort of just kind of airbrushed out of it, and I write a little bit about that. And then also looked at the things that George Orwell said about people in Britain and English people in England that also are not very introspective at all, and unlike Europeans and maybe unlike Afrikaners who, because we've had such a tortured history, and people are also very prone to self-doubt and so on. They're forever writing about who they are and whether they belong and whether they belong in Europe or here in Africa and so on. So there's a constant outpouring of that kind of thing in Afrikaans, but even among the sort of left-wing academics, especially prior to 1994, there was a huge number of articles and books and so on written about Afrikaner identity and how they could get Afrikaners to change and, abolish apartheid and go for multiculturalism and that kind of thing. And but that has now died down a bit. But nowhere did anyone ever, as far as I know, apart from this advertising thesis, write anything about what it means to be an English speaker in South Africa, and especially in this new kind of so-called rainbow nation that they're trying to create, and where they're taking over all these ready-made concepts from especially the US and to a lesser extent from the UK. So we've got this kind of very artificial identity that's being foisted onto us. And I think that's also the weakness of it, because it's not really working. And then you have somebody like Bok van Black singing that song, or a few of these Afrikaans movies coming out, and then suddenly it changes it all again, because that's so much stronger, that's so much more authentic and tied to South Africa than all of these sort of imported, multicultural notions from the US.
We spoke a little bit about that during the music break, but to get back to that, I said, as a resident of the UK, I keep running into ex-South Africans pretty much all the time.
I did in the US as well.
They're in the US, they're in Canada, they're in Australia, in New Zealand, etc. And you estimated, Dan, that there would be about 900,000 South Africans that would have left after the abolishment of apartheid. Right?
Yes, I think so, and they are spread over all these countries. If you look at the stats in each one of those countries, then you can sort of get an idea. Because fortunately, in most of those countries, there are fairly accurate census figures, so you can see the number of people who were born in South Africa. And also the number of Afrikaans speakers, that's usually underestimated. But for example, in Canada, I think about 11,000 people told the census form or wrote on the census form that Afrikaans is their home language, for example.
Okay.
And you've got a certain number in
my
Australia.
impression is that it's the English South Africans that have left.
You're right.
I've
I've also got that impression.
Way, so yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I've also got that impression that they were more prone to actually immigrate than the Afrikaans speakers, because they were more. I think a lot of the Afrikaners were not that shocked by what happened because they were sort of more reactionary in a way, and they expected things to go wrong. But a lot of the English speakers, they believed this kind of fairy tale that the foreign journalists were telling them that it's now going to be everything just fine and everyone is going to get along, and the economy was going to grow and there would be foreign investment and so on. And they've become very disillusioned with things in South Africa.
And you've been there longer, and I think that's a very important point. It's not as easy for the Afrikaners to go back to Holland or France or Germany, or it simply isn't.
Exactly. That's part of our dilemma, because we've got roots here, and we are so kind of rooted in the place, and people have lived for generations in certain areas. And they've with great difficulty created this sort of quasi-indigenous European culture. And as you say, and our language, even though it's very close to Dutch, it isn't Dutch. It's something different. It's the spelling, we decided to have our own spelling and so on. So the spelling is different, and the sound is different. The Dutch laugh at us.
And ethnically,
we laugh at the Dutch.
Yeah, and ethnically, you are a blend of
exactly.
Basically French, Dutch, German, yeah.
Exactly, and a bit of Scottish as well, because in the 19th century, the English thought they would sort of acculturate us by sending us all these Scottish preachers and so on, and pastors, but then who were also Protestants and Calvinists, but then eventually a lot of them Afrikanerized. They got sort of absorbed by their flocks, as it were, and they ceased. And you've got a lot of Scottish surnames in South Africa, and the people who have those surnames are also Afrikaans speaking. So there is this kind of. I know in my wife's family there was also a Scottish woman who got married to an Afrikaner, and few generations ago, and her grandchildren and so on at one point could hardly speak any English. Nowadays English is a bit more widespread, but in some of the rural areas up to about 20-30 years ago, it was almost a foreign language, and people could understand it sort of passively, but they couldn't express themselves very well in English. And a lot of the foreign journalists also took advantage of that by speaking to people in the rural areas, and they would sound very stupid on camera, because they just don't have that good a command of the language.
Sure.
Yeah, but we've got those roots, and that's a problem. So we can't just up sticks and go. People in the US, they look at our problems and say, well, why don't you come and live in Texas or in Montana or wherever? But it's not that easy. And you can't just do it overnight and go.
Why would you want to abandon the place that your ancestors have been, building and working on for so long now, to just give up on it? I know it's very easy for an outsider to say. But
the thing that I find really frustrating is that to some extent, our enemies have actually managed to avoid any real confrontation, because all of this urban terrorism and propaganda and so on from abroad, it did have an effect, but it wasn't a real war. It was sort of a propaganda war, but it never really came to a real confrontation. And even now, and now when, if everybody had just to slowly immigrate, the ANC would get this whole country on a platter without actually having fought for it ever. They would just get everything. They would get, all our assets and homes and universities and schools and everything, and without firing a shot. So,
which they would probably run into the ground within a decade or two.
That too. But South Africa still has a lot of mineral wealth as well. And
I'm just wondering if they would manage it properly, even if there were really no whites left in South Africa.
No, probably not. I mean, probably the place would run aground, and they would need foreign aid at some point.
I mean, look what's happened to Algeria, for example.
And to Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe was also a prosperous country, and within 20 years they went from self-sufficient, very productive agricultural and mining economy to a basket case where now they're getting food aid from the UK and financial injections from the IMF and so on. So South Africa would exactly go that route. It would they would deplete all the resources and the reserves and so on up to a point where they would need external aid to keep going. And already, when you're talking about things like AIDS, I mean, I ended up in some sort of state-owned clinic not far from here the other day because I urgently needed a medical certificate, and they gave me there and then an AIDS test, because everybody who goes there has to get an AIDS test. They've got to get an HIV test, and all of that is paid for by the US government. I mean, apparently Bill Clinton signed a law or something like that, and most of our anti-HIV measures and HIV tests and so on, which cost billions of dollars probably, all of that is paid for by the US. So if it weren't for that kind of thing, a lot of African countries would not be able to cope at all. And probably South Africa in the future will become more and more dependent on foreign countries. And that's where the West also made a serious mistake, because by stabbing us in the back, they are creating a liability for themselves.
Let me ask you about something completely different. You mentioned earlier Angola. Is there a sort of sense of solidarity between the South African whites with the mainly Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, or is it sort of worlds apart? Or
well, yes and no. During the 1970s and onwards, South Africa became the kind of the place of refuge for all the whites in Southern Africa. And in 75, there were about the Mozambican Portuguese fled to South Africa. The Angolans came here, and they were absorbed into our society and very quickly and so on. And even from the ex-Rhodesia. So a lot of them ended up here, and their children went to school here and university and so on. So they all became, a lot of them, the ones who didn't go back to Portugal, they became absorbed into South African white society. So, and I think in that sense, there is some sort of solidarity, and there's a lot of people here know a lot about those Portuguese colonies, and even in Afrikaans, talking about novels and things like that, quite a few of our novelists have written about those countries and stories set in Angola or Mozambique, and also looking at the sort of clash of civilizations between Africa and Europe set in that context. And these days, I mean, Mozambique is sort of being rebuilt at the moment with foreign World Bank capital, and a lot of South Africans are involved in that. I think we also mentioned that the government has a real dilemma in that even though it has affirmative action and racial quotas and so on, it isn't managing to actually keep the whites down as far as it would like. Because at the universities, for example, the black students have a very high dropout rate, and the whites tend to be much more successful in completing their degrees. And the other day, the statistician general of South Africa, who happens to be a black man with a PhD, possibly in statistics, I don't know, he announced some new report a few days ago in which he complained about the fact that there seems to be some sort of a glass ceiling for blacks in passing at university or qualifying, and they were largely and the black youth are largely unemployed. even the ones with degrees struggle to get jobs, whereas the whites, especially the ones who have university qualifications, there's almost 100% employment rate among them for the ones with university qualifications. So, and in certain area, I think in your more scientific and mathematical disciplines, I mean, that's completely dominated by whites, and there are just about no blacks in those areas competing with them. So they find jobs, often high-paying jobs. They become quite successful and so on. So there's a sense, and I've picked it up in various other articles written by other commentators, that affirmative action and racial quotas have gone as far as they can to actually get blacks to try and dominate the private sector economy, which they are not managing to do. And if you look at what all the black commentators, and especially the more left-wing white commentators, are writing, they're very, very frustrated about that. The fact that they can't, the revolution is simply not working in that area. I mean, they managed to completely transform, as they call it, the state sector and all the public enterprises, so many of whom have run into great difficulties as a result. I mean, a lot of them are bankrupt. For example, our national airline, I mean, it's a basket case, whereas before it was one of the best airlines in the world. But in the private sector, they're really struggling. And a lot of the whites have moved into the smaller kind of businesses, and they're quite successful in that. Unfortunately, the Afrikaners are not as successful as, say, the Portuguese or the Greeks or probably some of the English speakers, because they're more oriented towards a sort of a traditional kind of job in a corporate environment or a government environment, and they lawyers
or they're farmers or that kind of stuff. Yeah.
That stuff. They're not your sort of hustling type of a guy. He's now going to be a plumber. Next year he'll be doing websites. The year after that he's going to, maybe sell T-shirts at the rugby or that
exactly.
kind of stuff.
No. It's
although some of them are, of necessity going into those sorts of things. So there is a sort of a very Darwinian kind of struggle for survival here, and the survival of the fittest. And it's amazing how people are managing to make ends meet, and they seem to perform all kinds of miracles, in surviving in a very hostile kind of system.
Yeah, and it's very, very impressive how the white minority manages to get along in this very hostile environment. Although we have seen kind of an exodus going on since the abolishment of apartheid. I don't remember the actual numbers, but there are a huge number of whites leaving South Africa every year for Australia or Europe or the US. And based on that, do you picture South Africa going down the same road as Zimbabwe, or do you see a future for white people in South Africa in maybe 20 or 30 years?
If nothing else happens, if we just continue kind of in this limbo, in this current limbo, then we are going to end up there, because there won't really be any change of direction at all, and it'll just deteriorate further and further. But if we can manage to get ourselves together and, come up with some sort of coherent plan to oppose all of this and to create alternatives, then I think we can turn things around. Because we, paradoxical as it may sound, I spoke earlier where I said there never was any direct confrontation between the old, between the white minority and the ANC, no direct military confrontation or anything like that. In the Portuguese colonies and even in Rhodesia, there was kind of a guerrilla war of some description. So you could say that there was, but the ANC never got to that level. Apart from a series of sort of isolated urban terrorist incidents that were organized by the East Germans or the Soviets, or they didn't really do much at all. There never was a direct confrontation, and the whites have not really started to resist this system either. They sort of just played along all the time, hoping that things will get better, or that some of the more extreme ideas will sort of fizzle out and so on. But I think what's positive for us at the moment is this wave of sort of black radicalism, especially around this man called Malema, or
Julius Malema.
Julius Malema, yes.
He's the leader of the youth organization of ANC, isn't he?
Well, he used to be the youth leader, but he started to challenge the leader, so he got kicked out and he formed his own political party. They call themselves the Economic Freedom Fighters. And, he's sort of a classical Marxist-Leninist, and he wants to nationalize everything and take everything. He said it over the last few days that he's going to take everything that whites own. He's going to take it all.
Yeah, just
take
like
it away. So I think
like
he's
Mugabe.
actually, exactly. Yeah, sort of a Mugabe line or even worse. And he's starting to wake a lot of people up because they realize that either we're going to end up in that kind of extreme situation, or we're going to have to do something. Either we're going to have to immigrate, or we'll have to organize ourselves locally to resist this kind of policy, whatever form that might take. So
the thing is, not everyone can emigrate.
Exactly.
So yeah,
a lot of people
what do you think?
Too old or too young, they can't immigrate. So they have to stick it out here and see what we can do. And it seems to me that also with globalization and the growth of the internet and so on, we could integrate ourselves more and more into the global economy and do business in other countries, or import, export, or sell our services online and so on, so that this local kind of government and the local economy will have less and less of an influence on us. Already, some of these very highly successful business people who are unfortunately very apolitical, and they're not really doing anything to help us. But, there's a fellow down there in Stellenbosch, a businessman, his name is Marcus Jooste, and he's now the biggest furniture manufacturer in Europe, and he's buying, his company's listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. He's buying one chain after another in France and so on. And, he's completely, he doesn't care what happens to his local businesses because all of these assets are essentially in Europe. And he's simply just living a nice life in Stellenbosch, looking at the mountains and sort of counting his money and, following a kind of deploying his global business strategy. So if we can get people like that, but with more of a social conscience and maybe more of a, a desire to see things change here, things could change very quickly. If we get a few rich people involved, or people with money, and also if we can get maybe people from outside South Africa involved, because, with the decline of our currency, it's now, for anybody sort of investing in South Africa or in some business venture from abroad, it's just so cheap. And here we're in a very low cost kind of an environment where with a little money, you can create a lot of economic activity. And there are skilled people here which you can employ. In a sense, affirmative action has made whites in South Africa far more competitive because it's actually reduced their incomes. So you find very skilled people here who will be prepared to work for a quarter of the salary of somebody in Europe. They'll work for half the salary of the comparable black person in South Africa and a quarter of the salary of somebody in Europe or the US or Canada or Australia or any of these countries. So there are things, goods and services that we could sell elsewhere. And if we can just start, come up with a plan and start doing it. But unfortunately, people are often too pessimistic. They kind of become very despondent and they just complain all the time and they're not acting and just trying something new or trying to challenge the system in various ways.
What do you think? We've heard quite a bit about the Orania community, which I know is an Afrikaans community, all Afrikaans community in South Africa. What do you think? It sounded from what you said earlier when we were speaking that the chances for a democratic resolution to the problem is not likely in the near future. What do you think about this as sort of an example of a more communitarian solution, to have more of these sort of all white or all Afrikaans communities? Do you think that's something that could catch on, or is that kind of a limited case?
I think, look, Orania, there are only about 1,000 people living there, but it's quite a good model, and a lot of people are looking at that. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of talk about maybe starting another enclave next to the coast in the Southern Cape, but then naturally, because of the kind of violence and mayhem in South Africa, there are sort of natural white enclaves that even in the cities come about, where people just live in these gated communities and they reconstruct their lives within a gated community like that. So they kind of separate themselves off a little bit from the rest of what's going on around them. there's another community like that also next to Pretoria, which is also an explicit kind of nationalistic Afrikaner community called Kleinfontein. But even the people who are apolitical, they also live in places that are more or less a little bit segregated and so on from the rest. And of course, these things drive these multiculturalists and leftists and so on absolutely nuts. They complain about it all of the time and they think it's evil and so on, but there's not much they can do about it. Right next to where I live, there's another huge place that's being built by an insurance tycoon, and he's spending billions there on building a kind of a city with about 11 to 15,000 people. It's not explicitly political or anything like that, but it's sort of a safe space where people can go and live and be more or less insulated from a lot of the problems with criminality and violence around them. So
it seems like the idea is catching on more and more.
Yes, exactly. It is catching on, and since 1994, I don't think any traditional housing, except maybe in certain coastal areas or in the Western Cape, has been built. It's all been these gated communities walled off with heavy security and electrified fencing, cameras, so on. It's become almost like a science fiction society, because we live in a place where there's constant identity checking, fingerprinting, scanning of your driver's license and your car license and so on. So there's a sort of a privatized surveillance state that's growing up alongside this sort of politically correct Afro-Marxist state that the ANC has turned South Africa into. And the two are, in a way, in competition, and the private one is just functioning that much better than the public one.
But at the same time, you see sort of reports from South Africa about white people living in camper vans, whole families, yes, and that kind of phenomenon. Sure, in a huge number of impoverished whites.
Yes. No, you're quite right. That is a growing phenomenon, and I think a lot of the whites are underemployed, especially the ones that don't have very sort of high-level skills that are in demand in the private sector economy. And, for example, I heard a case the other day where somebody was looking for a driver to drive a vehicle, and he wanted to employ a white person, and he sort of posted it on Facebook, and within a few hours he had 100 applicants. So, there are people who are unemployed there, and the kind of their safety net consisting of family and friends and so on only goes that far. Mm. So we have a real problem that we have to address, and if we don't do it, it's going to get worse, far worse, and a lot of people will end up in these sort of places that you're talking about. I've been to a few of those, and it's pretty heartbreaking. And of course, with South Africa being so open to criminals and drugs and that kind of thing, these poor people are also their children and so on are immediately targeted by these drug dealers and so on. A lot of them do, because they've got nothing to do, they're jobless and so on. They end up being alcoholics or drug addicts. And there are a few churches and so on that have got social workers that they send to these places. But we've got to make sure that it doesn't extend any further than it has already done up to now. And that's why. But I feel that if we could create some kind of a movement, and even an international movement, we could create kind of pro-white businesses and networks and trade with one another and invest in one another's ventures. And that could help people here. It could help people in Europe and everywhere. There's also a huge unemployment problem in Western Europe, in the whole
absolutely.
Of Europe, among young people. Because you've got all these socialist governments who have, also spent money left, right, and center for years on all sorts of unnecessary things, and also to stimulate inward immigration and these refugees and so on.
Yeah, well, this is it. We've been unintelligent enough to import racial tension.
Yes.
Which is so incredibly stupid. It's just, it's criminal, really. It is.
Absolutely, and actually there is some interesting similarities there, because I believe we were tricked into accepting these these ideas of multiculturalism and mass immigration on the same grounds that white South Africans were tricked into believing that the abolishment of apartheid and so forth would be a good thing, and it would end up in some sort of harmonious multicultural society, which, I mean, are the core ideas that the liberals kind of have been pushing all over the Western world. For example, that everyone is the same, and the white people are usually quite naive and believe that, well, all the other ethnic groups are just like us. They just look a little bit different, but they will treat us nicely and be fair to us just as we have been fair to them, and so
yeah, and they'll be grateful.
Yeah, exactly. And what we see in
Yes.
Europe as well as in South Africa is, of course, the exact opposites. I mean, we see extreme anti-white hatred and violence and criminal acts directed, racially motivated criminality directed towards whites by the immigrants and by the black people in South Africa and so forth. And the only thing I wonder about is there really any hope of ever regaining some sort of political influence in South Africa for white people, or might it be a better idea to do a kind of tactical retreat to Europe, to friendly countries in Europe, for example, and try to kind of fight it out here? Because what we are facing right now is a historical clash of civilizations that will take part during our lifetimes, and I think the battleground will surely mostly be Europe, and here we actually have a chance. I think it's much more difficult for white South Africans to kind of assert their dominance through military means or political means or any means whatsoever in South Africa. So might there be some...
Well, they already did, though. I mean, they ruled it for quite a long time. So
but
why they couldn't again.
Yeah, there are plenty of reasons why they couldn't again, because the blacks are in control now, and without some outside force giving back control of the country to the whites, I can't really see that happening, especially since a lot of the black population has exploded since the abolishment of apartheid because of the huge migrant waves from neighboring countries into Africa. So the ratio between whites and blacks in South Africa were pretty rough before, during the apartheid era, but now it's extreme. Wouldn't you agree with me on that one, Dan?
Yes, I agree with you that the demographic ratio has deteriorated a lot over the last 30 or 40 years. But I think I mentioned not so long ago that, well, in a piece I wrote about a week or two ago, that there's kind of miraculous population explosion that you had in South Africa before, where the black population would double every 20 or 25 years. That has really come to an end, because, and I think mainly due to HIV, because it has really placed a sort of a Malthusian barrier on the black population. And there's the immigration from over our borders, of course, but there's a lot of conflict between the local blacks and the foreign blacks, and the local ones actually kill them. They kill some of them every day, and they actually, a lot of them give up hope and they go back to their countries. Some of them remain behind, but there's sort of a tension between the local blacks and the foreign ones, and the government tries to deny it, but it's there. And now and again, you've got these so-called xenophobic riots that break out, and then, when was it, 2010 or thereabouts, they killed about 80 foreigners within a few days. And a lot of them then wanted to leave and go back to where they come from. But what you said earlier on about the betrayal by the elites, we had it here. I mean, de Gaulle, even though he was probably a good leader in other respects, he betrayed the French Algerians. And I strongly suspect that going forward, most of the Western elites and European elites will betray their own populations as we go along, until there's some real political change, a Marine Le Pen coming to power, or maybe a Donald Trump, or any of those kinds of figures. But until that happens, the elites will continue betray their own people. Whereas here
they have done so for over 60
many
years.
decades.
Yes. But something that I see as a positive for us is that this kind of black revolution has also destroyed a lot of our elites. They've lost their positions of power at the universities, in the media, and in government, and they've been replaced by blacks mainly. So they can no longer harm us. And for us, if you look at our history as well, we had some pretty horrific battles and so on to fight against blacks, but most of the time our danger, the real danger, was other white people who could side with black tribes and then attack us and so on. And I think the more Europe and North America gets embroiled in their own multicultural problems, the more space it will open up for us here. And then we could start creating enclaves or, start not paying taxes anymore. Because we keep this government going through our taxes. The corporate sector and the white taxpayer, they keep these people going. They keep them in their big Mercedeses and BMWs and their high salaries and the bureaucracy. As soon as we start, closing the tap or the faucet, as the Americans say, they're going to run into huge problems. And their own people will turn against them because they will start rioting because they're not getting handouts anymore and so on. So if we can just get our act together I think there would have been some sort of revolt a long time ago already if it weren't for the fact that people here are very scared of the USA and the European Union and even military action from them on the side of the ANC to actually keep the current status quo as it is. If there had to be a sense that there wouldn't be any outside intervention, if there had to be some kind of political conflict in South Africa, a lot of people would start thinking along those lines. Because if you read what people write on social media and so on, they are fed up, they are mad and irate. And if some sort of populist leader had to stand up amongst the Afrikaners and with the right sort of global conditions, I think things could change here very quickly and people could reassert control over certain areas of the country, at least. Because, one advantage of the fact that things have deteriorated, and become so disorganized. Our military is really hopeless. They bought all these expensive fighter planes from Sweden during this corrupt so-called arms deal, but apparently only 2 of those planes are actually flying because they've only got 2 pilots. Because they've also had affirmative action there, yes. And the ground personnel have all absconded and gone to Australia and other places, so they don't really have the ground people to keep the planes in the air either. And that's only one example, but the entire military is in a shambles. So even if Zimbabwe had to invade us, I'm sure we'd have a hard time to keep them out here. So this government couldn't cope with any sort of organized rebellion from any minority group in South Africa, and especially from the white minority group. They couldn't cope with that. Definitely, only other whites could endanger us, and that's our real dilemma. And I think it's always been like that. If you look at the 19th century too, our main enemy was the British colonial administration, because and their missionaries and so on, and they constantly would side, with the tribes against us. And eventually we had that devastating war here, kind of a scorched earth war with concentration camps for the civilians and so on. And that was far more devastating than any of the battles we fought against the black tribes here. There was a massacre in 1838 where they killed 500, white civilians, women and children mainly, down in Natal. But shortly after that, a few months later, there was the Battle of Blood River, and where, a small group of 450 Afrikaner pioneers, beat the Zulu army of 10 or 20,000 warriors.
Yeah.
So, and there was an even more miraculous one in 1836, where about 35 people stood up to 6,000 Matabeles for half an hour, and they actually slaughtered them. So we've always been outnumbered. I don't think that's the problem. The problem is not the numbers. From people looking at it from outside, they think that the problem is that we are outnumbered. But we don't see it that way most of the time. You know, there's a province out here in the north which they now call the Limpopo province, after the river between us and Zimbabwe. And the white population, if you look at it statistically, they are only about 1% of the population there. So you would think that that place is hell on earth. And yet the white communities in that area are the ones that maintain themselves the best, where they have the best responses against farmer, attacks and so on, where they are the most organized, and where in their minds they are the healthiest, and they have got a strong sense of community, and they help one another, and they resist. I mean, there's this town there called Roodt, where the government has been trying to change the name for 15 years. And for 15 years, they fought them in the courts. They've actually kidnapped statues that the blacks put up, and they would move them to another area or paint them different colors. At one time, apparently the government deployed the entire National Intelligence Service to that province to try and catch these people who were kidnapping their statues. So there's a real sense of organized resistance in that area, and the whites there are only 1%. So it's the numbers are not the main problem. I think it's more of a mental problem and an ideological one. And I think that once we've overcome that, and given the aid of the internet and so on, there is hope for us, and we can cooperate with other Europeans in other parts of the world.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is a common problem, just as you're saying, for Europeans and European Americans and European Australians and what have you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in the world,
I especially like your positive outlook when it comes to the future of South Africa, because that is sorely needed in these times. People are way too defeatist and demoralized. They need to be provided with some hope and some positivity. We were actually drawing to a close of this excellent program. We have some minutes left, but we should start to wrap up. So please, Dan, the floor is yours for the remaining 5 or 6 minutes, and please tell us what you think is most important to communicate to our listeners, and also if there are any websites or anything else that you would like to promote, please go ahead.
Yes, well, we've got a website called PRAAG.org. That's PRAAG.org, and you can even, and that's all in English, where we write stuff and publish articles and things that people should know. You can also click on the Afrikaans website from there. There's a link there, and you can even use Google Translate to look at some of the other stuff we're writing in Afrikaans, which is more centered on South Africa locally and what's going on. We're trying to create initiatives to perhaps create employment for people, but also fighting this propaganda war that I was referring to, on our websites and social media. I think that's the thing that paid the heaviest toll on us. In the past, prior to 1994, we were reputed to be the 4th or the 5th strongest army in the world, but that didn't help us one bit in this whole battle, because it was more of a psychological war and a propaganda war, and we lost that one. So that's where we have to start. We've got to make people strong again, and we've got to give them something to fight for, and an identity and a sense of belonging and standing together, and that's the most important issue that we should be working on, together with the economic one, to make sure that we don't become completely impoverished, as you've also mentioned, where we've got these people living in trailer parks and squatter camps and so on. So we've got to try and address that issue as well. And then, we must try and forge links internationally between the expat South Africans in, all these countries abroad. I'm trying my best to make contact with those people and work together with them, learn what they're doing and how we can cooperate together. Because a lot of them still read what's going on here, and they follow the news here, and they still have a sense of being have some sort of commitment here, just like you're not living in Sweden, but you're still following what's going on in Sweden. And then, forging these sort of cross-border, cross-cultural links between Europeans and South Africans, Americans, Canadians. I think that's very important, and that's going to save us in the long run, because ultimately, we're just completely outnumbered. And I've written a series of 2 articles on the American Renaissance website, where I looked at the demographics of Africa, and people don't realize that, the African population is slated to double again within the next 30 years, and after that, once more. So ultimately, there are going to be, at the end of this century, there are going to be 4 billion Africans on the planet, and they're not going to stay in Africa because, there's no infrastructure in the rest of Africa. We've got a little bit of infrastructure here in South Africa, which is slowly deteriorating. But in the rest of Africa, there's nothing. There are no roads, there's no sewage, there's absolutely nothing. And those people will not stay in their countries. They will go abroad, and they will go to Europe or North America. So it's going to become a global problem.
Well, it already is.
It already is.
Yes.
And I also have to kind of object to the notion that there will ever be 4 billion Africans, because I don't believe that is kind of based on an assumption that demographical trends will continue to progress in a linear way, which I'm sure they won't, because the financial system will collapse long before then. The oil is running out. It's basically only due to the oil economy that we had this demographic explosion, especially in the third world, with the really efficient farming, for example, and food production. When the oil becomes too expensive, which we can already see happening in maybe a couple of decades, because the biggest oil fields are kind of running dry, the prices of food will rise, the production of food will decrease, and hence the world population will decrease as well. So I don't think we'll ever really reach that level.
I disagree, Daniel. I think, what you're assuming now is that the black population is going to sort of go Planned Parenthood, and I don't think that's going to happen.
No, right. On the contrary, what I'm talking about now is peak oil. Everyone agrees completely that the main machinations behind this extreme demographic explosion that we've seen all over the world, especially in the third world, has been made possible due to very high technological agricultural farming and the development of the whole farming industry, agricultural industry, which makes it very cheap to produce large amounts of food, which can feed more people and hence make it possible for populations to increase. But as soon as the oil reaches a certain price level, which it will, because it's a finite resource, it won't last forever. It already peaked, according to many experts on this, and what we can see now is kind of the post-peak process, when oil will start getting more and more expensive after this current oil price war stops going on between Saudi and Russia, which will only increase the speed for this to happen, because the biggest oil field in the world in Saudi Arabia, the Ghawar field, is kind of drying up. And as soon as the oil economy...
I'm sure that's true, but how would that make these people stop reproducing?
Because they don't have enough food to eat. It's as simple as that.
Recreating, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Well, if there's not enough food to go around, there can't be more people. People will go back to having maybe 10 kids, and 8 or 9 of them will starve to death, and 1 will survive, which will decrease the population. It's basically...
Yeah, it'll probably be like that, yeah.
Yeah. So,
but the thing, in this country, people, 10, 15 years ago, they were also saying that, especially around 2000 or so, they were predicting that AIDS will have such a huge impact in South Africa that you could actually see people just kind of collapsing in the street, and the population was going to reduce and so on. And even though there has been a huge impact from AIDS, we haven't seen that. You don't see people just dying on the street from AIDS. I mean, you can go to the clinic and they can tell you, okay, 1 out of 10 people tested here is HIV positive, and in the sort of certain age bracket, say from 16 to 40, it's maybe a quarter of all people who are HIV positive. But if the US can pump billions into sort of giving people antiretroviral drugs and so on, I mean, they will put money also into food production. As you say, well, and the oil. I mean, there are alternative sources of energy too that they are developing. Germany is very strong in that.
But there hasn't yet been any invention of an alternative energy source that has even come close to oil when it comes to energy efficiency. So even if we come up with alternative sources, the global possible energy output of the world will be significantly smaller than what it is today, which means the populations will decrease. It's kind of a mathematical fact. And also, we should not forget that the richest and most productive economies of the world are also deteriorating much in the same fashion as South Africa, for example, Germany, France, Sweden, the US, due to these problematic demographic trends, due to mass immigration, due to multiculturalism, due to all the chaos that follows from all these crazy experiments, which means finally and ultimately it means that all of these countries, all of these economies will have to put more focus on dealing with their own problems and less focus on pushing or pumping money and resources into the third world to help their populations grow. So I think that we are kind of getting near some sort of population peak when it comes to numbers within the next 1 or 2 decades. And then it will kind of reverse and go back. So that's my firm opinion. I just wanted to weigh in on that. Is there anything else you would like to add before we kind of wrap up, Dan?
Yeah. I think we'll also try and on our website also put out some reviews and discussions and so on of some of the movies and stuff being produced in South Africa. Even though some of it is in Afrikaans, they've normally got English subtitles, and some of the stuff also ends up on torrents and stuff. Eventually once DVD comes out, and people can download it sometimes even for free, or they can buy the DVD and then and they can sort of watch what's going on. And
that would be great, and we would be happy to republish articles from your site at writeon.net in English. If you can provide us with some English translations, that would be fantastic. And,
yes, I've also been thinking of maybe writing a book about South Africa's history in English, because there actually isn't a good book that you can recommend to someone telling the whole story from the founding of South Africa in 1652, right, through the great betrayal of de Klerk up to the present moment.
Well, that's something, if you know someone who could write it, that's something definitely Arctos would be interested in. So.
Well, I think Dan is suggesting that he would write it himself, since he's actually very good and excellent writer.
I've spent quite a lot of last 15, 20 years reading quite a lot of South African history, and there are books and fairly sizable volumes and so on have been written, but they've all got some sort of flaw in my view, and one of the biggest flaws is that there's no sort of central theme in the thing. It's just an enumeration of facts and figures and dates and so on and events, but there's no unifying theme in the book. And as we've seen until now, this kind of, call it the clash of civilizations, or the trying to found a new civilization and protect it from what's encroaching on it from outside. I think that's been the central theme of South Africa, and probably the US and even Europe now, because at one point, Europe was very much threatened by Islam and the Turks, especially. But for hundreds of years, Europe lived free of that. Ever since Queen Isabella kicked the Moors out of Spain, until very recently, Europe has been free of any external sort of civilizational threats. They were more concerned with there were internecine struggles and ideological conflicts within Europe itself. But now it's again becoming a civilizational struggle and conflict. So I think, probably people will be interested in reading something, an account of South Africa's history from that kind of point of view.
Oh, absolutely.
I think so.
Absolutely, and we would be more than happy to publish it. So feel free. So don't keep us in mind when you decide to write such a book. And with that, I want to thank you very much for participating on this show. And also, I want to thank all our listeners for listening, and tune in again in a few days. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.